In the autumn of 1925, a Greek photographer and geologist named N.A. Tombazi was serving as a member of a Royal Geographical Society expedition, mapping the southern glaciers of Kanchenjunga, the third highest mountain in the world, working the punishing terrain of the Sikkim Himalaya at an altitude most people never experience in their lives, where the air holds barely half the oxygen it does at sea level, and every simple task takes 3 times the effort your body expects it to. Tombazi was, by every account of the people who knew him and by his own careful, scientific writing style, precisely the kind of witness whose testimony was difficult to dismiss. He did not travel to the Himalaya looking for a legend. He did not believe, walking into that expedition, in the creature the Sherpas and local porters spoke of in low, matter-of-fact tones around their fires at night. He was there to document glaciers, to take careful photographs of ice formations for a serious scientific institution, and he approached the mountain the way a trained observer approaches anything, with instruments, with notes, and with a deliberate resistance to reading more into what he saw than the evidence actually supported. He was camped at roughly 15,000 feet in a stretch of high valley near the Zemu Glacier, when his porters called him urgently from his tent one afternoon, pointing down into the valley below at a dark shape moving against the snow, 200 to 300 yards distant. Tombazi raised his field glasses and watched. The figure moved upright, on 2 legs, in a gait that struck him immediately, and against his own inclination toward caution, as unmistakably human in its basic mechanics, pausing occasionally to pull at the low, tangled branches of dwarf rhododendron bushes scattered across the slope, the way a person might absently pick at foliage while walking and thinking about something else entirely. It showed dark against the surrounding snow, and Tombazi, watching closely through his glasses for the better part of a full minute, could make out no clothing on it whatsoever, no pack, no equipment, nothing that would explain a lone human traveler surviving, unclothed at that brutal altitude. His porters were already certain, before he had lowered the glasses, of exactly what they were looking at. They spoke the name for it quietly, the way people speak of something they take entirely for granted as real, and are only surprised that an outsider needs it explained to him at all. Tombazi did not accept their explanation. He has said, in his own later account of the sighting, that his working theory in the moment, and for some time afterward, was that he had witnessed a wandering hermit, one of the ascetic holy men occasionally known to live in extreme isolation at high altitude in that region, and that the strangeness of the sighting owed more to the improbability of finding a lone man in that terrain than to anything genuinely inexplicable about the figure itself. The figure moved on and out of sight before Tombazi could close the distance or gather any further detail. It was roughly 2 hours later, as his party continued their descent along the same general route the figure had been traveling, that his porters stopped again, this time pointing down at the snow itself. Tracks, clear, unmistakable, pressed into the surface in a line that followed the same path the dark figure had taken. Tombazi examined them closely, applying the same careful, skeptical scrutiny he had applied to everything else on the expedition, and found himself, for the first time, genuinely unable to reconcile what he was looking at with the explanation he had already settled on in his own mind. The prints were bipedal, unmistakably so, spaced in a stride pattern consistent with the walking gait he had observed through his glasses. But they were small, only 6 or 7 inches in length and roughly 4 inches across at the widest point, a size that fit no adult human foot Tombazi had ever measured or observed, hermit or otherwise, and that matched no animal native to that altitude capable of producing a track with that specific, biped-shaped structure. He recorded the measurements carefully in his own notes, the way any serious scientist documents an anomaly he cannot yet explain. And he continued his expedition, and he wrote about the sighting afterward with the same measured, careful language he applied to his glacial photography, offering no dramatic conclusion, no claim beyond what he had directly observed and measured himself. What has kept Timbazi's account under serious discussion for a full century, longer than almost any other sighting associated with the creature, is precisely this restraint. He was not a man inclined to see monsters. He went looking for a mundane explanation and found, instead, a set of measurements that fit no mundane explanation he was ultimately able to construct, and he said so, P.L. Ainley, in his own words, leaving the conclusion open in a way that a century of subsequent investigators, far less careful than he was, have never quite managed to close. He never saw the figure again. He never learned, by his own admission, what it actually was. He only knew, for the rest of his life, exactly what he had measured in the snow that afternoon, and that no explanation he was ever offered afterward fit those measurements as cleanly as the one his porters had already been certain of before he ever lifted his field glasses at all. In November of 1951, the British mountaineer Eric Shipton was leading a reconnaissance expedition along the Nepal-Tibet watershed, part of the broader effort to map a viable route up Mount Everest that would, less than 2 years later, culminate in the first successful ascent of the mountain by Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay, two climbers who were, at that very moment, working as members of Shipton's own reconnaissance team. Shipton was accompanied on this particular stretch of the expedition by Dr. Michael Ward, and the two men were crossing a high pass at roughly 19,500 feet when they came across something neither of them could immediately account for: a line of enormous footprints pressed into the snow, running down from a secondary pass above them and continuing on across the glacier ahead. They had no measuring equipment with them suited to the task, no ruler, no formal survey tools, but Shipton, with the practical improvisation of an experienced field mountaineer, used what he had. He placed his own ice axe alongside one of the clearest prints for scale, and had Ward, no small man himself, stand his booted foot beside another, and photographed both, producing images that would, within weeks of their publication in the Times of London, become some of the most widely reproduced and fiercely debated photographs in the history of unexplained phenomena. The prints were not small. Set beside Ward's boot, the comparison left little room for a viewer to imagine they were looking at anything closer to human scale, and beside Shipton's ice axe, the depth of the impression in the snow was, by the account of expedition member Tom Bertolin, written in a private note shortly after the discovery, deep enough to draw a direct and pointed comparison to the depth Ward's own considerable weight had left standing beside it. The two men followed the trail for the better part of a mile, tracing its path across the glacier, watching it hold a consistent stride and a consistent depth the entire distance. The specific, patient regularity of something moving with purpose across brutal terrain rather than the erratic wandering a smaller, panicked animal might produce. Bertolin, reviewing the photographs and the account afterward, wrote plainly that whatever had made the tracks was not any animal he understood to live in that part of the Himalaya, and that its evident size, based on the depth of the impressions relative to a grown man's own footprints beside them, ruled out the smaller, more mundane explanations that skeptics would spend the following decades attempting to apply to the case. The photographs reached London by early December and were published within days, and the reaction was immediate and overwhelming, propelling the word Yeti into global popular consciousness in a way no prior account, including Timbazi's careful, restrained sighting nearly 3 decades earlier, had ever managed to achieve. Newspapers across Europe and North America ran the images on their front pages. Scientists, mountaineers, and skeptics alike weighed in for years afterward, offering explanations ranging from a Tibetan blue bear crossing its own tracks in a manner that could mimic a single, larger biped print, to more exotic possibilities that Shipton himself, a careful and experienced expedition leader with no evident interest in manufacturing sensational claims, never fully endorsed or fully dismissed in the years that followed. What has kept the Shipton photographs at the center of the debate for over 70 years is the same quality that made Tombazi's account credible a generation earlier: the specific, professional restraint of the men who produced it. Shipton was not a fame seeker. He was, by every account of his career, one of the most respected and technically skilled mountaineers of his generation, a man whose entire professional reputation depended on the kind of careful, sober field observation that made sensationalizing an unexplained set of tracks a genuine risk to everything he had spent his career building. He photographed what he found with the tools he had exactly as he found it, and he let the images speak for themselves. And in the 70-plus years since, no explanation offered for those specific photographs, taken by that specific expedition at that specific altitude, has ever fully and conclusively closed the case in either direction. The glacier is still there. The pass the tracks came down from is still there. No one has ever followed a trail like it again, in that exact place, with that exact depth, and returned with an answer more certain than the one Shipton and Ward carried down off that mountain in the winter of 1951. In the spring of 1970, British mountaineer Don Willans, a blunt, practical Manchester plumber turned world-class climber, was working as part of Chris Bonington's expedition, attempting the notoriously difficult south face of Annapurna, one of the tallest and most dangerous peaks in the Himalaya, sent ahead with fellow climber Mike Thompson to establish and scout a forward camp before the main team began its assault on the mountain's most technical sections. Willans was not a man given to imagination or exaggeration. His reputation among fellow climbers was built on exactly the opposite qualities: blunt practicality, dry humor, and an unsentimental toughness that had carried him through some of the hardest technical climbing of his generation, which is part of why what happened at that forward camp has remained difficult for the climbing community to simply wave away in the more than 5 decades since. Around 5 o'clock one evening, as Willans was setting up his tent for the night, one of the expedition's Sherpas, a man named Pemba Tharki, glanced toward a nearby ridge and said, in the same flat, unremarkable tone he might have used to note that dinner was ready, that the Yeti was coming. Willans turned in time to catch only a shadow, dropping quickly out of sight behind the ridge, gone before he could bring any real scrutiny to bear on it. The following morning, walking the same slope with Thompson, Willans found tracks pressed into the snow at almost exactly the spot where the shadow had disappeared the evening before, and he photographed them carefully. The same practical instinct that had made him a respected professional climber, leading him to document rather than simply speculate about what he was looking at. The 2 Sherpas accompanying the pair that morning, by Willans's own account given afterward, looked at the tracks and said nothing at all, neither confirming nor discussing them, moving past the discovery with a specific, deliberate silence that struck Willans in retrospect as its own kind of answer. That night, under a bright, clear moon that lit the surrounding slopes almost as clearly as daylight, Willans caught movement again, this time close enough and sustained enough that he had time to retrieve his binoculars and bring the shape into genuine focus. He watched it for nearly 20 full minutes, at a distance he estimated afterward at roughly a quarter mile, moving across the snow with a powerful, bounding gait on all fours that Willens, an experienced observer of mountain wildlife from decades spent in remote high-altitude terrain across multiple continents, was confident did not match the movement pattern of any bear he had ever personally observed. He would say afterward, in the plain, understated language typical of everything else he ever said about his career, that it looked like an ape to him, and that he did not think it was a bear, a conclusion he offered carefully, without embellishment, from a man whose entire professional life depended on the accuracy of exactly this kind of field observation. The creature eventually moved off into shadow and did not reappear. Willens never saw it again for the remainder of the expedition. In the morning, he discovered that his personal stash of chocolate bars, kept in his tent, was gone. He never offered a dramatic explanation for the missing food, mentioning it afterward in the same dry, understated tone he applied to everything else about the sighting, and it has remained, in the decades of retelling since, the detail that somehow unsettles listeners more than the 20 minutes of direct binocular observation that preceded it. The specific, mundane proof that whatever had been watched moving across that moonlit slope had also, at some point in the night, been close enough to his tent to take something from inside it without waking him. Willens went on, weeks later, to reach the summit of Annapurna alongside Dougal Haston, one of the hardest and most celebrated technical ascents of that era of Himalayan climbing, and he carried the story of that forward camp with him for the rest of his career, telling it the same understated way every time he was asked, never adding drama that was not already there, never walking back a single detail of what he had watched through his binoculars in the bright, clear moonlight above the Annapurna sanctuary. He died in 1985, having spent 15 years fielding the same questions about that night from journalists and fellow climbers, and having given, by every account of the people who knew him best, the exact same plain, matter-of-fact answer every single time. He saw something on that slope, he photographed its tracks, and in the morning something had been in his tent. He never claimed to know what it was. He only ever insisted until the end of his life that it had not been a bear,